Right, we're going to conclude our look at the discarded image. Introduction to Medieval and Renaissance Literature. This is a sort of grammar to the period. Lewis himself describes it in his own work. That's going to be of interest when we come to the 7 liberal arts he discusses at the end. He doesn't actually do anything with the quadrivium. I'll try and say a little bit about it. He just says that he's not sufficiently knowledgeable of the quadrivium to comment much upon it. He talks about the trivium, grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And we'll get to that. We left off last time by talking about the longevity, the long-lived, and we focused specifically on the elves, which I thought would be of interest. And Tolkien, for those of you who are aware of it, was very much bothered by the portraiture of elves, and specifically how they'd been reduced to these little sprite-like, impish fairies of Disney, etc. He thought there was much more to that, and he thought that was of interest. I wanted to talk about some of the other aspects of the discarded image today. I'm going to focus a great deal of the class on human nature, because I think that a great deal has been done on that front to change our view of what human nature is, and it is of great interest in our day, precisely because I think that human nature is being forged, as it were, by various literary theories, among other things. But there's a long runway up to that period where we really get what we might call transhumanism or posthumanism in our day. And Lewis describes that to some degree beginning in the Enlightenment. So I'll talk about that. And the best way to see it, though, is actually by looking at a world that didn't see things that way. And so Lewis repeatedly talks about the significance of old books to defeat chronological snobbery, among other things. We're sort of, we like to see ourselves as reasonable, inclusive, moderate, good-willing people, and devoid of prejudice, hostility towards people. That's how we want to describe ourselves. And yet, the basis for the judgment that we are that is usually lacking any substance. There's no reason to think that. It's just a very pleasing fiction we tell about ourselves. And we actually have no grounds for comparison, even. So, I mean, if you only look at yourself in the mirror and you say who's the most beautiful one of all, and you only see yourself, then I guess it's going to be you. And that's pretty much what the contemporary era does, is it looks at itself and it has pronounced itself to be of greater ethical standards than anything that had been achieved throughout human history, without any knowledge of human history. So it's really more of a posture. And we can posture all we want, but we can't call it learning. And we can't really argue for the position, we just simply have to assert it. And those that oppose it, we're going to demonize. That's not really the way I want to proceed through life. But if I'm going to equip you to do otherwise, then we have to look at something that is different. So we're going to look at what happens in the model. Remember last time we talked about astronomy and the Ptolemaic cosmology and its defeat, if you will, by the Copernican. It's not really defeated, it's a better model. It explains things better. The old one does not go away. It remains popular in poetry, in hymns. It has certain associations with it that are very useful. And I suggested some of the reasons why the new model is very problematic. It creates all sorts of psychoses that largely come from a lack of relationship, a sense that things don't connect to each other. There is no overarching connection, and there's even between things, there is no connection that we ourselves don't initiate. But that's not the medieval view, it's not the biblical view, it's not the ancient view. It is a very mid-19th century and beyond view. But its beginnings you can already see after Descartes. Descartes seizes upon the consequences of this and really, in a thought experiment, pushes it to an extremity which probably never ought to have been taken that seriously. But it was seriously, and it's, if you study modern philosophy, it's Descartes is taken to be the beginning of modern philosophy. And one of the things that's most problematic to me about Descartes is his understanding of human nature, which is we know it, everyone knows Descartes for the cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am, right? But they don't attend to the fact that it comes through the method of doubt. And actually that precedes that assertion, cogito ergo sum. He talks about the fact that he's doubting. And that's the method of doubt, because what he previously regarded as certain, the fact that the sun went around the earth, that was a certainty. There was no doubting that. But now, because of the new philosophy, the new astronomy, he's come to doubt what his senses previously revealed to him as absolutely certain. So he wants to find a basis for certainty going forward, and he does that by using doubt as basically a razor to cut away anything that he can't be certain about. And he gets down to the point of he can't doubt that he's doubting. That's about it. And if it's actually, that's the first point in the chain. And so I say, and I think there's some profundity to this, and I don't hear much about this, modern philosophy is actually predicated not on knowing or thinking as if thinking didn't happen before, because the medieval period is intensely rationalistic. We get our philosophical origins from Plato and Aristotle, all the categories and stuff. They happen to think, believe it or not. They give us our categories of thinking. What characterizes modern philosophy is doubting, starting from zero. And that's going to become consequential. I doubt, therefore I think, therefore I am. That chain. Nietzsche will say of Descartes' conclusion, he never proved that he existed. He proved that he was thinking. That's it. He didn't establish the fact that that he existed. He just established that he was thinking. And of course, well, if he's thinking, then he must exist. Yeah, but that's not a necessary conclusion, says Nietzsche. So this idea of doubt being foundational creates a breach with the past, because it's making an assertion that eventually the force of which will be undeniable to everybody that follows, namely that previous knowledge is not to be trusted. Appeals to authority matter for nothing. The methodology of the Academy, the Royal Academy of Science, was nullius in verba. Nullius in verba. It's Latin. Let me take this off so I don't yank it down. I'll write it down too since we don't learn Latin. Nullius in verba, which basically means trust no one's word. Trust no one's word. Test it. Verify it for yourself. Use the empirical method, scientific method, which you're taught in school, right? That's how you're going to know with certainty. You're going to be able to observe it by following the methodology. Descartes writes his Discourse on method. Modern philosophy is very much about method, which ignores a lot of the causality of Aristotelian philosophy, like the idea of an initial cause and a final cause, like where do things originate, what's the purpose of things, and what's the ultimate outcome of things, towards which do they tend. Philosophy in the modern sense tends to focus on getting the right method. But the right method, if you only follow that method, excludes the possibility of the knowledge of the past, because it's, again, following nullius in verba as its axiom, more or less. I don't care what Aristotle said. I don't care what Plato said. I don't care what Scripture said. I don't care what Aquinas said. You make the argument. So they're going to talk about logic. But then, does logic actually change? And the answer is yes, it does. And we're going to look at that as well. So huge consequences here. Astronomy we saw already, and I briefly alluded to the fact that astronomy was connected with a variety of other things. And the fact that we have 7 liberal arts and one of them is astronomy will be the tell. One of them is geometry, which is literally the measurement of the earth. But another is music, and another is arithmetic. Those 4 are the quadrivium. Those are all the sciences of number. So number is a means of apprehending reality. A particular type of reality. A non-human reality, I would say. And it is real science, for sure. And the human reality, however, is connected through the trivium, which is grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. And they're stages. One is based on the other. Grammar is the foundation for dialectic. It's the first thing you learn. You go to grammar school in English, historical education. You go to a grammar school. You don't only learn grammar in the sense of what we call grammar, that specific subject that breaks down things in terms of terminology that we call grammatical terminology we find very tedious. It's the essential knowledge that you need in order to understand things. And grammar is a part of it. There's an order to things. And it describes the relationships that if you don't follow the rules of the language, which we call the grammar, then you speak gibberish. The order is in the wrong way. You don't understand cases and so forth. If any of you speak a language other than English, English is a non-inflected language. If you learn German or Latin or almost any European language, I don't even know about non-European languages, but you can move order around a lot, but then the relations is reflected in the words. And how do I make sense of what you're saying? It's not just saying the words so that they're articulate, but that I understand what is being conveyed behind them. Well, then you have to have grammar there. Well, there is a grammar to everything, and this book, The Discarded Image, is a grammar about, he calls it a grammar book about the medieval and Renaissance periods. It's trying to give us the necessary tools to understand a different way of looking at the world. He's going to say a lot more about that. He will largely say it in his epilogue, his comment on it. He doesn't want to go back to it, which we might think. He's a medievalist, Renaissance scholar. He loves it. He loves the model. Does he think that the right way forward will be to go backwards? The answer is no. But he does want to suggest that there are things about the older way of looking at things that were more rational, more humane, more profound, more beautiful, and really are the way that the world functioned throughout human history, up until very recently. And then there's the breach from that. So we can't go back to the past. However, you can learn from the past and bring it to the present. And that's the aim, I think, here. And I think Lewis himself is exemplary in this. That's what makes him a great apologist. He brings his medieval scholarship, which is a different way of looking at things, and brings it to contemporary topics in a way that people find, how on earth did he think to come at it that way? It's because he was a medievalist, that's why. But also, he very much thought about things from another perspective, namely his contemporaries. I think he thought that they were insane, appealing to reason. And they thought the same of him, by the way. So I mentioned B.F. Skinner, the behaviorist psychologist. He wrote a book, his last book, called Beyond Freedom and Dignity, and said that Lewis was the foremost representative of a tradition defending freedom and human dignity. And he thought this ought to go. Isn't that interesting? So if you think Lewis is being hard on the social sciences and the psychologists and the sociologists and the human sciences in general, think what they say about him. The idea of human freedom is a myth that needs to be got rid of. The idea of human dignity is an impediment to science, says Skinner. Lewis and Tolkien are the most popular writers of the 20th century for many people. Tolkien certainly is. He's the author of the century. When I was in Britain in the year 2000, there were studies that came out. There were surveys of the British populace, and Tolkien came number one repeatedly. It drove the establishment crazy. Because they don't even read him in university. It's not even in literature. They don't read Tolkien. But in the popular imagination, he is the greatest author. Most people likewise love Lewis. How is this? Like, what is it that makes them this? Particularly since it's not because they're Christians. People don't even know that Tolkien and Lewis were Christians. It's not that. I mean, Christians might find a particular meaning in Lewis and Tolkien's work, and I think they're correct in doing so. I do. But it's not that alone, because the number of people that appreciate both men without being committed to Christ, is far greater in numbers. So, what is it that they've put their finger on that their contemporaries have ignored? Is it just antiquarianism or a sort of romantic medievalism? People just like old things. Just like to imagine a period like that. When things were different, when people could see their opponent right in front of them and have a sword and have a hand-to-hand combat virtue, right? Not bombs from a great distance and that sort of thing, but your enemy be right in front of you. We could marshal ourselves in great armies, and there would be a sense of valor again. I think there's something to that. But I think there's more to that in Lewis and Tolkien, and for me this is very interesting. I mentioned the astronomy. I'm going to focus now on the Earth and her inhabitants. Dante makes a really interesting suggestion, he notes, which is that human affairs are ruled by fortune, and fortune is blind. This is not a common medieval view, by the way, but it is Dante's suggestion. The Earth, unlike the other planets, does not have an intelligence presiding over it. It does not have an archangel. The archangel that was presiding over the Earth may have been Lucifer, but now he's fallen. We live on the silent planet. All the other planets sing. They make music. They're part of the celestial music. We talk the music of the spheres. The Earth does not. It doesn't make that. It doesn't have an intelligence presiding over it. Our angel fell. Men are regularly in error. Things change. There's often no obvious reason why they do. The world is marked by disorder as much as it is by order. Whereas beyond the sun, there's perfection. The order is there. It's mathematical, it's musical, it's astronomical. And there's absolute clarity there. There's no inconstancy. Whereas on the Earth, because of the fall, everything beneath the sun is subject to mutability, change. We can see it in the moon. We can see it regularly around us. Because of that, things are not ordained in cause and effect ways as we would like to imagine them to be. It's not the way the Greeks saw it, as fate. It's not just deterministic in that sense. There's an element of fortuna. Things change. Nothing remains the same. No nation is going to stay in its position eternally. So reading from him, the conception that the rise and fall of empires depends not on desert nor or on any trend in the total evolution of humanity, but simply on the irresistible rough justice of fortune, giving all their turns, did not pass away with the Middle Ages. He quotes Thomas Brown of the 17th century. All cannot be happy at once, says Thomas Brown, for because the glory of one state depends upon the ruins of another, there is a revolution and vicissitude of their greatness. A globalist order would seem to them impossible and certainly not happy. Someone is going to benefit and someone is going to be crushed in the process. That's just the observation of human history. I should say something Lewis observes. This is why this overhead's behind me here. They did not think that the earth was flat. That notion has gained a little currency in recent years. I think in general, I might be wrong about this, because the whole academy is distrusted profoundly. And so all of the accumulated knowledge, it's almost the Cartesian thing coming back to bite us. I'm not going to trust what the authorities say. I have to prove it with my own eyes. Well, the world seems flat. Nobody in the medieval period, or almost no one, thought this. It was an absolute fringe position. Those that say that they did think this were just being mischievous. They thought that the world revolved. There was a movement. It's a sphere, as you can see from these. This model of the world, the Hereford Cathedral's Mappa Mundi, is quite extraordinary, and it looks flat. Well, of course it is. It's a map. If you want a globe, then it'll be round, but it's a map, so it's flat. The other thing that we need to remember is, and I didn't talk about this because we didn't do the first lecture. I'm going to throw it up on the website. I did it before. Is the idea that the Earth is composed of 4 zones, and the middle zone, which we call around the equator, is regarded as so hot that it's uninhabitable. You can't pass through it. It's too hot for life. Well, if you're from Europe and you start to voyage and you hit the equator, it's pretty hot. And how much hotter is it going to get? Oh, I think it's plenty hot enough. We'll stop right there. We're not going any further. It's too hot to pass. But on the other side, they think that there is another hemisphere. And if you read Dante in his Inferno, he describes exactly that. Lewis says it's an instance of the first instance of science fiction. When Dante the pilgrim is crawling down through the Inferno, remember it gets narrower and narrower and colder, and as he gets down to the bottom, there's Lucifer stuck at the bottom of the pit, and he has to creep down his sides, and he's going down, 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 and then suddenly he gets through the middle, and suddenly he's facing upwards. How is that possible? Well, because he's passed to the other hemisphere. But you can't voyage there. It's a place you can conjecture about, but you can't actually go there. This is Lewis's suggestion based on the sources. It makes a lot of sense. Why did they not know about South America? Why did they not know? They didn't voyage there. Some suggestions of ancient sea kings who did, by the way, but that's another topic. He doesn't speak about that. I won't go off on that topic. Where was paradise? Well, many think it's in the remote east. It's a Jewish romance about Alexander, about 500 AD, that suggested it's there. And later writers will speculate on that, because it's a thought. Where is it? Where is this place from which mankind fell? It's somewhere in the remote east of us. But not flat. That defied all of their sense of logic. Again, how do you explain physics, the fact that things incline towards something by an appeal to a flat earth? Because it goes down to the earth. Like, it goes down towards it. What does that have to do with the flatness? Nothing. And everything tends downwards. Why does it do that? Well, because the Earth is at the center of things. They don't use the word gravity, but they understand the concept of gravity. Galileo, in one of his experiments, drops things from the Tower of Pisa. See the speed and so forth. But he knows it's going to hit the ground. Everyone observes that. Why does it do that? Well, because the Earth is at the center of everything. And therefore, it's not a flat thing because everything's in circles around it. So this is also, right? Anyway. The next thing I want to talk about, which he speaks about briefly, is animals. This is the Aberdeen bestiary. One of the worst areas, or the most embarrassing areas of knowledge in the medieval period, is that of biology. Lewis explains this a little bit. I just think it's interesting. I'm not going to spend too much time about it. But he says that most of the zoology of the period is imaginative, fantastic, and they know it. Remember, they live in the presence of animals in the way that we don't. They construct all sorts of beasts on the basis of authorities, on the basis of things that they read in previous authors that they've never seen themselves. They find interesting, they speculate on it, they throw it into their own fiction, and this is interesting. So we just hold on to it. But they did not think that the creatures actually existed, he thinks. This is really fascinating. So let me draw this beast that I've read about in others. He mentions on page 147 that the source of this was likely Phaedrus. But he says from Herodotus, so the earliest Greek historian, on down, the classics are full of travelers' tales about strange beasts and birds, tales too intriguing to be easily rejected. And other authors will be basically storehouses of these stories, and they get passed on because the authorities have an authority. It's not an unimpeachable authority, but it is still an authority. It's been written down. People have tried to preserve this in memory. We need to attend to this. And sometimes they're not very critical of that. They just hold on to it. Let me talk about one particular type of animal, and that is the dragon. That's one that people find really interesting. Phaedrus, not the subject of Plato's dialogue, but an author in the 1st century, is writing something like Aesop's fables, and he speaks of a dragon. I'm going to quote here in Book 4, Section 20, a creature born under evil stars, disiratus natus, and doomed to guard against others the treasure it cannot use itself, would seem to be the ancestor of all those dragons whom we think so Germanic when we meet them in Anglo-Saxon and Old Norse. And I'm just going to read what he says here. The image proved so potent an archetype that it engendered belief, and even when belief faded, men were unwilling to let it go. In 2,000 years, Western humanity has neither got tired of it nor improved it. Beowulf's dragon and Wagner's dragon, and we could add Tolkien's dragon, are unmistakably the dragon of Phaedrus. It's the same. It has the same attributes. Christians will associate it also with Satan because of Revelation 12. Right? Now, the source of this transmission is Isidore of Seville, who he will cite when he writes De Descriptione Temporum. That's the name of Isidore of Seville's work. Lewis will cite that. I should say, and this just a little tangent, but interesting, the connotations of dragons is the opposite in China. In China, dragons are auspicious. It's a good sign and lucky. They're magical beings. They tend to reside in the water. whereas our dragons reside on the earth. Ours are associated with evil, and a particularly pernicious sort of evil. In Beowulf, more or less satanic. But I have spoken about that online. You can go to a Beowulf lecture on that. But the dragons in Chinese understanding are omens of good luck, and these are good things. So modern takes on dragons, where they're trying to tame a dragon, is the mixture of the two, more or less. You know, that popular kids movie or whatever, How to Train Your Dragon. You don't need to train a Chinese dragon because it's not hostile. And you can't train a Western dragon because it's evil. In Chinese culture, they're important because it's part of the yin and the yang. Very much a part of the philosophy. The dragons are the yang. They're bright, they're masculine. They're related to the sun. The phoenix is the yin. It's dark, it's feminine, it's associated with the moon. The two together are connected in a symbol of harmonies, right? That idea that good and evil are in some sense both necessary and both harmonious is not a Western idea at all. It is, however, in the Rings of Power movie, but don't let me digress onto my trashing of that terrible series, because I do that already online and in the gentlest way I can. And it's not that gentle, but it could have been a whole lot worse. But these are the Western dragons are evil, they're malevolent, and there is no bargaining with them. You cannot tame a dragon. It's not a dragon if you can tame it. It just isn't. It's there to destroy you. And it is implacably evil. Now, Tolkien presents that view of a dragon. For those of us who say it doesn't matter, in one sense it doesn't, but in another sense it very much does. If one represents evil that cannot be placated, then it also says that there's a categorical distinction between good and evil, and right and wrong, along with it. They're not two sides of the same coin. Evil is not necessary for good. It's the absence of good. It's the lack of good. It's the privation of good. It's a cancer on the good. It's a shadow of the light. But it is, in every sense, lesser than the good. That's going to fit with Christian theology. The other, not at all. It's going to totally undermine it, destroy it, in a way that we would describe as evil. Maybe even supernatural evil. So there's the contemporary portrait of dragons I find deeply interesting, but also concerning. But he just mentions that. I think it's very interesting. When it appeals to authority on these matters, he mentions that, first of all, authorities are seen as a high court of appeal, but not the absolute standard of appeal. Isidore of Seville, whom I just mentioned, makes no difference between authorities. So he will cite the Bible, Cicero, Horace, Ovid, Martial, Pliny, Juvenal, and Lucan, chiefly the latter about the nature of snakes, and he gives them all the same level of authority, more or less. And when he does that, he gives no allegorical interpretations of that Lewis talks about. I think that's interesting. And Lewis's comment is, when you look at the medieval bestiaries and the portraits of the animals, and compare them, his assessment, we're not in this class going to go into it to the degree he has. He says we have to wonder how much they actually believed. Are they just having fun? Believe some of it, but enough of it, well, this is just interesting. I said I wanted to talk about human nature. I'm going to spend a great deal of the class on that. He talks about that when talking about the human soul. So let's come to that. It is not the Enlightenment that declares that man is a rational animal. Aristotle says that. a pre-Christian author. That's what distinguishes it. We are rational animals. But that means that we are not like Descartes portrays us, not necessarily anyway. We think of rationality associated with Descartes because of the methodology, and when we think about thinking, we think about the res cogitans, the thinking substance. Cogitans is cogitation, thinking, and res means a thing. Res cogitans is what he calls the mind. The idea of reason doesn't originate with Descartes. It originates even before Aristotle, but Aristotle gives this summary definition there. It's a rational being. But that means that we are a composite being, because in Christian thinking, the angels have a rational nature, but not animals, so say the scholastics, at any rate, but also a bestial nature, because we are like the animals. Whereas the animals don't have a rational nature. So the angels have a rational nature but not a bodily nature. The animals have a bodily nature but not a rational nature, and we have both. So when we say that we are a rational animal, the word animal is just as important as rational. When you come to evolutionary thought, we're going to hold on to one part of that. When we come to Descartes, we hold on to the other. We're rational. The other says we're an animal. Well, both are true. It explains why the medieval period, this idea that we are a composite being, like an angel, but also like a beast, why we, in this period, see the idea of the microcosm and the macrocosm. Because we fit the heavens, we fit the earth. Hamlet talks about it. What a piece of work is a man. So he's a cross-section of all the different varieties of being. And he bears the imago Dei furthermore, the image of God. And God is, of course, a spirit, but also rational. His ways can be reasoned with, although there's a limit to how far we can follow that rationality. Now, the rational soul is not the only kind of soul. So humanity possesses a rational soul. There are other types of souls. He gets this from Aristotle, this idea that there are different types of soul. There is also a vegetable soul, and there is a sensitive soul. A vegetable soul has certain powers. What are the powers of a vegetable? Well, just think about them. Nutrition, growth, and propagation. Think of a plant. It takes in nutrients, it grows, and then it drops its seeds. That's a vegetable, that's a soul. There's a certain type of property there that defines it. That is true of human nature, by the way, as well. So we have properties that would be attributed just to the vegetables. But we have got more than that. We also possess a sensitive soul. These are more like what we find in animals, however. They have sentience. They have a sense of awareness. But they don't have a power of reasoning. Reasoning is chiefly expressed through speaking. They make noises. They have some sense of what the noise is, but there isn't an articulate noise, per se. And there's no development. There's no intellectual development. There's no culture to animals. They do the same things. However fine their birdhouses are, you don't see new birdhouses by the same species. It just doesn't happen. They may have many different types of thatched, and they use different materials, and you can laugh at them and find isn't it extraordinary, the variety of different birds, but the birds don't create new types of birdhouses. They fit their particular kind. So a sensitive soul is to be found in animals. It has all of the powers of the vegetables, but also has sentience. It has the senses, the five senses. It can see things, it can hear things. It can taste things, it can touch things, it can smell things. Those, the five senses that animals have. We also have that. So we have a vegetable soul, We have that in common with the vegetables. A sensitive soul, we have that in common with the animals. But then in addition, we have a rational soul, which we have in common with what? The angels and God. Descartes' conception will acknowledge the rational soul, but will deny the other two. And then he has the problem of how do we connect his body with his mind. And remember, it's called a mind now, not a soul. How do we connect the mind, or the res cogitans, to the body, which he calls res extensa? So the mind. Herein lies the problem right there. It's the same thing, but it's an extension of reasoning. The body then becomes something like a machine, but it's not like the animals then. It's not like the vegetables. It's just an extension of mind. It becomes, he overstates the case. Human distinctiveness. Darwin will do it in the opposite direction. So will the behavior psychologist, by the way, like B.F. Skinner. He sees human beings just like the animals. They can be taught to behave through classical conditioning. You touch this thing, I'll zap you. You do this, I'll reward you. You can tell that the behavior psychologists are in charge when human responsibility is denied its validity. So it's all of those things. Now, all three kinds of soul are immaterial. This is a little bit confusing, but you can't actually see that. You can see a body, but the soul per se part of it is immaterial. But the life of a tree is not something that we can identify. We can't empirically observe that life or the soul of it, but it's the thing that allows all those things that are properties of vegetables to grow. Right? What is that thing? Or can you get the life out of it? No, you can't. But it's what makes a vegetable act like a vegetable. It absorbs nutrients, it grows, and it propagates itself. Yes, but that thing that allows that to happen, we can't see it. It's immaterial. Now, the peculiarity of a rational soul, that is what people have, is that it is created in each case by the immediate act of God. Each person, unlike animals, an individual human being is, God intervenes, and it is a miraculous occasion when a human being comes to earth, which to life, which I think everybody intuitively senses when they have a child. There's something that is beyond words in the appearance of a new life, human life. Other things, vegetables, animals, come into existence through developments and transmissions of the natural world order. They just keep on going. Human life is distinct, which is why God forbids us to take it. But it doesn't forbid us to take vegetable life or animal life. There's no prohibition against that, because it's a different type of life. It is life in all three cases. It's not to be abused as such, right? There's a dominion mandate. You're to be good stewards over the created order. Yes. But the rest of the created order, the vegetables and the animals, propagate themselves, and they simply carry on according to the original law there, and there is no need for a special act of creation each time it happens, whereas here there is. Now, modern science denies what I've just said about humanity being distinct, but we'll get into that. So when repentance happens, conversion happens, the poets talk about a return to the kindly inclining which characterizes the whole of creation to begin with. It's fit in with the way things were meant to be. Before that, you were distorted, you were turned away from God, even though you ought to have been turned towards Him. You ought to love him. You hated him. You had your back turned to him. Hence the call to repent. Hence the need to preach the gospel. Hence the need for Jesus to go even call his disciples. He goes out and finds them. Crowds follow him. Do they actually believe in him? No, they don't, and he doesn't call them. They believe in him after. At first, he's just, this guy's going to give us food, and there's something extraordinary. The crowd follows everybody who is doing wondrous things. So that needs to be stated. Then let's talk about the nature of the rational soul. This is where the biggest distinction is going to come. So I talked about different aspects of human nature in terms of souls. We don't normally talk about a vegetable, but they do, and it's important, I think, because it illustrates what Descartes gets rid of, the connection between mind and body, and bodies, our bodies and the bodies of animals and the bodies of vegetables. They have certain properties that we share in common and so forth. But how about the rational soul? He particularly digs down on this. Now, there are two faculties within the rational soul, and this is really important, I think. You don't ever hear about this in modern philosophy. One is called intellectus, and the other is called ratio. The one that is called ratio is the one that is going to reign in modern philosophy. The intellectus is going to be wholly neglected, rejected, denied. But, and in one of my favorite writers, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, he flips it around and says that, and he follows Kant, Immanuel Kant in this, he thinks that reason is above the intellect. It's a higher power, whereas the medievals, the Renaissance, would have put it the other way around. It's the intellect that, or the understanding that precedes reasoning. Fides quaerens intellectum, faith-seeking understanding, not faith-seeking reasoning. What is this? He notes that Boethius, it will be remembered, well, he said it back when he was talking about Boethius in the first part, which I didn't present to you here. He distinguishes intelligence from ratio. So intelligence is connected with intellectus, and intelligences are associated with the planets, that is with the angels that supervise them. These are intelligences. And the intellect is that in man which approximates most nearly to angelic intelligentsia. It's a shadow of that intelligence. So Aquinas describes it this way. He says the intellect, intelligere, is the simple, that is the indivisible, the uncompounded grasp of an intelligible truth. Whereas reasoning, ratiocinare, is the progression towards an intelligible truth by going from one understood thing point to another. Well, modern rationality, that's what it does. It reasons from this to this, from this point to this, but it never gets to the higher things. It never gets there. It denies they even can be known. That's why agnosticism seems a rational position, because it is a rational position. It just is a position that lacks any understanding. It itself forbids the knowledge of higher things because it sees reasoning as only having one faculty, and that is the faculty to distinguish this from that, and to jump from one fact to the next fact and talk about the logical connection between them. And he illustrates this. You can go to yourself 157 if you want to this. They illustrate the difference between intellectus and ratio, or intelligence And reasoning is like the difference between rest and motion. You can observe motion. You can't observe rest, really, of an object. It's just there. It's not. But motion, you can say it goes from here to there. You can observe two different points. In mathematics, they'll tell you that you can't actually measure a point. You just have to conceptually think of a point. Remember in mathematics they talked about this? So this is a point, but actually this doesn't exist. But you have to conceptualize that it exists in order to see the movement from this to that. Okay, so because then you can see the motion. And if you couldn't see the point, you couldn't see the motion. You have to be able to conceptualize it. Anyway, the difference between them is thus like the difference between rest and motion, or between possession and acquisition. And I'll just read him here. We are enjoying intellectus when we just see a self-evident truth. It's self-evident that God exists. Of course he exists. That's not using our reasoning. When our opponents say, you have to persuade me by means of reason, I can't persuade you of something that's self-evident. If you can't see it, you're never going to see it. You're asking me to appeal to a faculty to get to something that faculty is incapable of grasping, because it's a different faculty. It's not irrational. It's required for the lower capacities to function, in fact. And without that, then we get into the follies of modern atheists like Richard Dawkins. Regularly embarrasses himself. I talked about that in a previous class. But he says, we are enjoying intellectus when we, quote, just see a self-evident truth. We are exercising ratio, that is reason, when we proceed step by step to prove a truth which is not self-evident. Which is not self-evident. Then we can use it. But some things are simply self-evident. You have to assume that they exist in order to do any reasoning. And quite frankly, reasoning without self-evident truths, and it can't function at all. You have to start from somewhere. That's why Descartes started from the fact that he had to have a point of certainty. If you don't have a point of certainty, everything is going to be disputable, and in which case you can never come to a conclusion. You have to have a fixed point to start with. It's Archimedes' principle. Give me a fixed point and I can revolve the world around it. I need a point of fixity. That is something that you have to have as a datum, a given. You start with that. Kant reinvents them. He calls them the categories of reasoning. I think he comes up with 9 of them. These things are to be understood as given. Otherwise, I can't go anywhere with this. So even Kant, with his pure reason, appeals to things that are to be understood. So, and Lewis comments on this. He says, a cognitive life in which all truth can be simply seen would be the life of an intelligentsia, an angel. A life of unmitigated ratio, on the other hand, where nothing was simply seen and all had to be proved, would be presumably impossible. For nothing can be proved if nothing is self-evident. You have to begin with something that's self-evident. And among other things, you have to take it as self-evident that reasoning is valid. It follows the laws of logic. This is, by the way, one of my explanations for what's happening in contemporary academic work, is they deny the fundamental laws of logic, which is why you can self-identify as a male and as a female. Well, this defies the basic laws of logic, in which case it's irrational, in which case, if I accept that as true, then thinking is impossible going forward. I can accept it. Sure, you say it, you say okay, but I can't understand it. It's impossible to, and it can't be understood furthermore. It just has to be accepted. Okay, but now we're not talking about anything that can be what we would call scientific then. It can't be proved. You've effectively said that. That is I would say, the downgrade from the premise that everything is to be rationally understood. I think it begins with Descartes. It takes a long time to get to its end point. I'm not even sure we're at its end point yet. And this is interesting, and this is where he expands. And if you read The Abolition of Man, heard me my take on it, and you want to look further into what he says about this, go to pages 158, 59, and 60. And he comments on where this came from. I commented on it, and I said that he didn't observe the way it contradicts what Paul says in Romans 1 and 2 in particular, the natural law. Here he does. I'll just read a bit of it. He says, nearly all moralists before the 18th century regarded reason as the organ of morality. How can you have an organ of morality if there's nothing that is self-understood, like the fact that you have a body and that your body has certain functions? If you don't connect the mind to the body, and because the body is just an extension of the mind, then the body doesn't have different characteristics comportable with reason, per se. Anyway, he says nearly all of them regard this, and the moral conflict was depicted as one between passion and reason, not between passion and conscience, or duty, or goodness. Prospero, in The Tempest, in forgiving his enemies, declares that he is siding not with his charity or mercy, but with his nobler reason. The explanation is that nearly all of them, that is, everyone before the 18th century, believed that the fundamental moral maxims were intellectually grasped. Remember what I said earlier? Not rationally grasped, intellectually grasped. As soon as you say it has to comport with reasoning, then you appeal to empiricism. That's David Hume's objection, the fact-value distinction. We can only reason about facts. We can never reason to the point of values. Yes, you're correct. He's correct. You can't. However, you have to regard certain things as self-evident in order to reason at all. And you're denying that. And you're also denying that these things are higher, not lower, not to be dismissed. This distinction, even in the Middle Ages, was used only by philosophers, that is, between reason and intellectus. So he's giving us the distinction. I think it's helpful. But he says sometimes writers will refer to reason and mean understanding. And when they talk about a higher or nobler reason, they're appealing to understanding. That's what he's saying. They'll sometimes talk about right reason. And they mean understanding then, and not what we mean by reason. Anyway, so he says that even, so the 18th century witnessed a revolt against the doctrine that moral judgments are wholly or primarily or at all rational. So it takes place in the 18th century in the Enlightenment. He just talks about that. Let me move on because I'm not going to. There's so much I want to talk about here. I think it's too interesting and I'm going to get lost between them. By the way, what connects the soul and the body is the spirit in the medieval understanding. What they mean by the spirit is unclear. And it's not clear amongst them. Lewis can come to no conclusion. It's just a connection between heaven and earth. It's the thing that connects a body and a soul. It's a spirit. What is the spirit? Who knows? There are sort of poetic descriptions of it. It's called a subtle knot in John Donne. Timothy Bright says in his Treatise of Melancholy, page 168 here, they are, quote, a true love knot to couple heaven and earth together. Yea, a more divine nature than the heavens with a base clod of earth, so that the soul is, quote, not fettered with the body, as certain philosophers have taken it. The body is a prison house, Stoic philosopher, right? But handfasted therewith by that golden clasp of the spirit. That's what holds the body and soul. It's the spirit. But what this is exactly is not clear. Lewis can find no clarity on the subject. They have to have something to connect them. How do you connect the divine and human nature? In Christ. There has to be something. It's the spirit. What is that? It's the connecting thing. Then we get to the tempers. Oh, I knew I needed that for some reason. I put it up on the website. The tempers, which explain something of what we call modern psychology, which is connected with its view of physiology or chemistry. We have 4 different contraries within us. There are 4 elements. There are also 4 contraries that we experience. connected with the elements, so the elements earth, air, fire, and water. In our bodies, they are experienced as humors. So the hot and the moist make blood, the hot and the dry make choler, choler. The cold and the moist make phlegm, and the cold and the dry make melancholy. And these will be combined in a particular way. And sometimes, and they fit our understanding of our, what I guess we now call psychology. And it's still preserved in the English language. You can lose your temper. These are the tempers. You have a certain temperament. Some people have different temperaments. Some people are more choleric than others. Others are more phlegmatic than others. Others are more sanguine than others. Sanguine refers to the blood. To be sanguine is more cheerful. Intellectuals are usually portrayed as melancholic. So you can lose your temper or you can show your temper. And in both cases, it's using more or less a synonym. One, you're losing it, the other is you're showing it, but still you're demonstrating something about yourself that might not have been apparent there before. He talks about that. If you want to look at his description of it, go to pages 171 to 173. Let me say briefly what he says about history now, because we're talking about the earth. Let's talk about human history. This is a significant passage to my mind. And I'm just going to read, and so you get the full sense of what he's saying here. It has sometimes been said, and he more or less agrees with what he sometimes said, but he'll add a little bit of commentary, that Christianity inherited from Judaism and imposed on the Western world a new conception of history. What was the old one? To the Greeks, we are told, the historical process was a meaningless flux or cyclic reiteration. The four ages of man, the golden age, the silver age, the bronze age, the iron age, cyclical. The eternal recurrence, as Nietzsche calls it. That the reason Lewis is going to disagree with this is he said, well, actually in Northern Europe, the Norse didn't have that view of history. So even when we're talking about European history, we're talking about Roman Greek history. We're not talking about what happens there because the Norse have a very different view that actually does have a purpose and a trajectory, and the trajectory is Ragnarok. If you've seen the Marvel movies, you know what that is. It's the destruction of everything. That thing, it is going somewhere. It's going towards destruction. That's not the Roman Greco-Roman view. Theirs is the cyclical thing, however. So Greek historians thus wrote, so significance was to be sought not in the world of becoming, but in that of being. Not in history, but in metaphysics, mathematics, and theology. So it pushes the Greeks and the Romans in the direction of theology, interestingly. Isn't it interesting that God, in human history, pushes himself into the Roman Empire? And that pushes them by the intellectual inheritance in the direction of thinking about the higher categories of the mind and spiritual things. It pushes them that way. And at the same time, it does not deny the physical body per se, or it sees the contradictions there at least, but it's going to have to reverse those when we reflect on what the incarnation means about human nature. That's one of the big changes right there of Christianity. But anyway, hence Greek historians wrote of such past actions, the Persian or the Peloponnesian War, or the lives of great men, as have a unity in themselves, and were seldom curious to trace from its beginnings the development of a people or a state. So they don't explain everything in terms of Romulus and Remus. Very rarely do they do that. There is one exception, and you read it. Virgil's Aeneid, where because of that one man, Aeneas, the Roman people have this inheritance, and it's going towards the great Roman Empire. So it's connected with a man. But that's unusual for Roman historiography. And that's because Virgil's a poet, not a historian. But he has something like a history there. But on the other hand, history, in a word, was not for them a story with a plot. It had no plot line. It was just a story. It wasn't going anywhere. The Hebrews, on the other hand, saw their whole past as a revelation of the purposes of Yahweh. Christianity, going on from there, makes world history in its entirety a single, transcendentally significant story with a well-defined plot, pivoted on creation, fall, redemption, and judgment. Now, compare that with what we do now. So those two ways of looking at it. Is it cyclical? Has it got an eschatology? It's going in a direction. There will be the revelation of the last things in the book of Revelation. Has it a beginning, and it's going towards that? That's the Christian view. On this view, the differentia of Christian historiography ought to be what I call historicism. The belief that by studying the past, we can learn not only historical but meta-historical or transcendental truth. That's modern historians tend to think that is the case. They think that we can learn things from history about the future. Where do they get this idea from? It's not from the pagans. It's not from the Norse. The Norse know where the future is going, and it's to Ragnarok. The Christians know where it's going, and that's the city of God coming down from heaven, dressed like a bride. There's a consummation. There's the judgment, last judgment. In modern historiography, they hold on to the idea of a revelation of meta-historical or transcendental truth, but they dissociate it from Christianity. So they talk about progress, the myth of human progress. Or history shows that. They will appeal to this to talk about what's going on in the future. I call it futurology. So Novalis, a German poet, calls history an evangel. Hegel saw in the progressive self-manifestation of absolute spirit. Carlyle calls history a book of revelations. They're historicists. They see it unfolding towards a future that we will see what happens when it happens, but it's not going to be something that can be predicted. It's going to be absolute spirit. It's dissociated from the flesh. It's dissociated from the vegetable and the animal. As he says, this is not true of Norse mythology, but it is true of our historiography. I'll skip over that because I will lack time. As much as I want to dally on that, I won't. Let me talk about the 7 liberal arts. Do you have comments or questions at this point? Because I moved on quickly, and I will talk about the 7 liberal arts. It sounds odd, he says it sounds really odd to talk about an educational curriculum at the end of this whole medieval and Renaissance worldview picture. But he says the reason why it's necessary is because the whole path of education is connected with all of these things that he's just described. All of it, it's an integrated whole. And there are arts. Now the word art comes from the Latin ars, which is a way. Remember in The Abolition of Man, the second chapter is called the Tao, or it's actually called the Way. That's the title of it. It's called the Way. And the Way there is in reference to the Tao, which is the moral law which was denied in the 18th century as having a validity, but he said was actually at the essence of what we would have called education in the past. Because human beings have a moral nature, unlike the animals and unlike the plants, but certainly like gods and the angels, we have a moral nature, so we need to teach in that particular area and not treat children like little trees or little animals, as behavior psychologists will. You can see where there's a clash of worldviews between the B.F. Skinner's psychological and the Lewis's here, who's going to defend freedom and human dignity by appealing to morality and self-regulation and using example in the classroom. ideas of right and wrong, transgression, and so forth. This is at stake here. So the 7 liberal arts, I mentioned them already. I'm not going to write them down because I'm running out of time. The 3 being the trivium. So grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric. They are distinct, and yet each is taught within it. You never abandon the grammar. When you're in the rhetoric stage, you're appealing to the grammar. You require the grammar. So sometimes it's considered that you do them in terms of stages. You can talk about them as the roots, the stem, and the flowers, if you will, if you want to consider it that way. The one is the foundation of everything else. If your grammar doesn't hold, then you can't speak powerfully and beautifully and persuasively. If you don't have any roots, then you can't, through dialectic, observe contradictions and the laws of logic, because you don't have anything to work with there. So it's a necessary stage. Also, human development fits this, by the way. Children love to repeat things at a young age. They like imitation. They imitate you if you're the parent. Everything you do, for good or for ill, you're going to be copied. And it can be very embarrassing in public. But that's what you do. Children, by their nature, imitate. Aristotle says this is another feature of human nature. By their nature, human beings love to imitate. He notes this. We could say, and we would rightly say, so do the apes. So do all animals. So in that sense, he's observing something that is true of us and the animals. We love to imitate. We do what, the little bird does what the mama bird does. The little chimp does what the adult chimp does, and sometimes it takes longer for that to develop. But it is a part of our nature then to imitate. That part of us can be conditioned. The animal part of us can be conditioned. The rational part, the spiritual part, the moral part can also be conditioned, of course. But it can be conditioned to act as if we have no chests, which is a contradiction of our very nature. It can be conditioned, but it ought not to. There's something deeply wrong in that. So let's talk about these. The grammar. Grammar is the skill of speech. When they taught grammar, they were talking about Latin grammar, by the way. Latin was like English is these days. It was the world currency. Except it had the great additional benefit of being rooted in certain texts. Now, English is not a bad language if you're going to have a common language, and I think one that has been, in which the categories, the words have been transformed by Christian thought, is not a bad one, where there's a sense of freedom as being an indelible human right. So we can talk about a charter of rights and freedoms. English is not a bad one. It's not in every culture, believe. I don't need to tell you. You know that that's the case. So it's there. It's a sense of an inheritance. Can you prove it rationally? Other cultures will say that isn't the case. It's not true about human nature. It's true about your culture, but not true about ours. At that point, you have to concede you're correct. And at that point, then you have to say, but is there such a thing as common human nature? And does this concept of freedom and dignity fit with that? Well, it doesn't if you only follow the prescriptions of the conditioners, because they deny freedom and dignity. In fact, they want to eradicate it, and they think that it's called education. Lewis is calling it propaganda, more or less. We'll do this next semester. Lewis is going to talk about the now, when he talks about in Out of the Silent Planet, a rational being that is extraterrestrial even, and so forth. Trying to establish that this rational nature has a moral nature as well, and on the planets that are outside of the Earth, they never contradict their moral nature, unlike us who do. And that's because we're a part of a fallen world. We've experienced the fall. They have the possibility of falling, but they're not inclined towards it. They don't go that way, whereas we do, and we even think that it's rational to sin. We rationalize it. They find this very extraordinary. So Lewis is going to, so here he looks at it backward historically. Let me show you how things were in the past. When he comes to science fiction, he's going to say, let's look at science fiction. Imagine a planet that wasn't fallen, and how would they engage with us? And in both cases, he's doing more or less the same thing. He's allowing us to look with a different different glasses. Like where we can't see clearly, we throw the glasses on. Oh, suddenly I see something I never saw before. Gosh, I'm running out of time. But what he did say is that in the epilogue, and I'll just quote here. The change of models did not involve astronomy alone. It involved also in biology the change, arguably more important, from a devolutionary to an evolutionary scheme. The old way of looking at biology was that it was entropic. It was degrading. It was declining. By the way, this is the scientific view. You can observe gene deterioration. This is why copying errors. This is why the human genome is getting worse and worse and not better and better. We're not actually progressing biologically. It's rather the opposite. Because of sin, there's degeneration. You can observe it naturally. It's entropy. But we move away from that, and we actually act as if that was not the case because we want to promote an evolutionary view. In other words, things are getting better and better. That's part of the view of human progress. From a cosmology in which it was axiomatic that all perfect things precede all imperfect things. It has to start perfect for it to be, and then it becomes imperfect. To one in which it is axiomatic that the starting point is always lower than what is developed. So in the old way of looking at things, the Christian way, the classical way, it began in perfection and then it moved to imperfection. Whereas our starting point is it began in imperfection and it's moving towards perfection. And that's why we should not look to the past. It's a different presupposition about the nature of the world. We take it as a given that things are getting better and better. The other way of looking at things would never have come to that conclusion. Why do we think that's the case? He's going to suggest that in De Descriptione Temporum, it's largely because of the development of machines. We use that as a test case for everything else. My iPhone now is better than the iPhones 5 years ago. The ones from 10 years ago are like a brick. Human nature is the same way. Human knowledge is the same way. We don't need old knowledge. The textbooks can be removed from our libraries and purged, which they are in fact doing in the TDSB, because we don't need that sort of knowledge anymore. It's moving away from the intellectual towards the rational. There is rationalizing going on. There's also a belief that it's getting better. Are these logical statements or are they expressions of belief? I think the latter, and Lewis thinks the latter as well, but he also thinks that it is contradictory all over the place. Anyway, we're done for now.